Hi everyone, today we're going to run through a co-working feasibility study. This is going to be the first of many. Today we're going to run through a 2-floor scenario that's around 2,000 square meters in size, or 21,000 square feet, depending on which part of the world you're in. And I've laid this out in a way where it's everything that you need to think about in order to pull together a compelling FISO, as I like to call them. FISO short for feasibility. And I've done many of these for, over 30 locations globally for investors and landlords and even other operators, ranging from 1,000 square meters or 11,000 square feet all the way up to 50,000 square feet or 5,000 square meters. I don't know why I inverse those metrics, but there you go. And there's obviously going to be a lot more detail behind this. So there's a link in the description if you want to reach out to me if you'd like a feasibility done or if you just wanted to have a chat about it. And so that you can have the confidence to set up your own co-working business or at least to investigate what that could look like. But let's get started, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these boxes and explain the thinking of how I'd approach or I do approach FISOs. And we'll start on the left-hand side because, before you even get into metrics and numbers and all that kind of stuff, it's really good to think about, what you're dealing with, okay? And I'm going to skip for now around, data around the location, a competitor analysis of the area. Let's just assume you've got a bunch of that stuff through desktop research or you kind of know the area. For the purpose of this video, we're going to dive straight into the floors. Okay, so let's say you've got level 1, level 2 across 2,000 square meters. General rule of thumb, before we even get into where it is in the building, is I'd like you to stack as much of the operationally heavy stuff on one floor. Okay, and let's say it's level 1. So let's say you've got your core here for both floors, and we'll color it around. We'll kind of enter through the lift lobby and everything. And you've got your concierge in the middle there. All of your kind of like meeting rooms and all that kind of stuff, I try and like group them together because when you think about it, your full-time staff, let's say for a space of this size, you've got maybe 2 full-timers, maybe 3, depending on the level of hospitality and experience you want to deliver. You don't want them running up and down between both floors all the time. And, they can, but ideally you optimize what they're doing by keeping all of that stuff in one area. So let's say we'll call this MR for meeting rooms, and it could be scattered across the floor. Let's just play make-believe right now that this is the perfect floor plan. Because realistically, all around that facade area, even on level 2, they're going to be broken up into private offices. So we'll call these POs, right? Because you've got the view. Now, I'm assuming you've got lovely natural light coming in on almost every angle so that you can capitalize on that in terms of really good offices and desks. But let's just pretend this side here on both floors, you've got no natural light, like it's all dead. I would prevent putting those private offices in that area. I would try and get creative and put rooms in there that don't necessarily need as much natural light. So think of podcast studios, right? Or think of media studios that you don't actually want natural light because you want to control the lighting. Like, for example, I'm shooting in my garage right now. There's no natural light because I've shut everything off and I've just got a light pointed at me right now so that we can control it so that we're not at the mercy of suns and clouds and all that kind of stuff, right? So those rooms do really well in those locations, and they're actually quite popular right now because corporate content creation is on the rise, right? You could put private event spaces there if you really want, because these days there's a lot of presentations that are done. I find really funnily in Australia, those beautiful ballrooms that have ridiculously great views, they end up being covered with curtains most of the time because someone needs to do a big presentation, right? So they end up getting rid of the view. So those rooms work really well, okay? I'd also try and put, if you've got your staff down there, like a bunch, if we take this whole area here, I'll call it A, like your amenities. So your cafe lounge area, if you've got some sort of cafe kiosk there, loose furniture and fitting. So if you want people to have accidental collisions and informal meetings and all that kind of stuff there, put it there. And then get creative. Like, what are you doing about your space so that it's not just offering a desk and flexibility? What kind of cool, unique amenities can you put in there? There's some really beautiful offices out there and buildings where they've got music rooms, I recently did a podcast with a very senior person at Lease in Australia. Her name's Charlotte, and she said on this US trip where she visited some of the best buildings out there, they had a music room as an amenity. And that's literally, it had a piano and a bunch of instruments, and it was all soundproofed. And it wasn't necessarily because they had musicians in the building, like a music company, but everyone learned an instrument. A lot of people learned instruments at some point growing up. So it's just kind of like, you can feel like a kid again and be playful. So you're going to do something like that in there. Like, what can you do to even make sure that your marketing collateral is a bit different because you're putting something in there that no one else gets, right? Because I feel like the beer taps, the table tennis tables, the nice furniture, the event space, it's all been done to death. Everyone's got it, right? So what else are you doing? Just food for thought there. Now, so if you start putting like the meeting rooms and the amenities down there, you're kind of losing some of the NLA on level 1 for your desks because you're putting that stuff there. So the desk density on level 1, and we'll get to the density metrics, is going to be lighter than 2. And 2 is almost, just think of it as your workhorse. Like, that's where majority of your offices and your desks is going to go. In terms of splitting private office to open plan desks ratios, I would say it's almost like a 90 to 10 ratio, like 90% private offices, 10% open plan desks. And I say that because once upon a time it was close. It was a 60-40, 60 offices, 40 open plan, but that kind of disappeared after, a few years ago, because the demographic of the users now that want flexibility and co-working are more larger companies or enterprise style clients that want a private office, a serviced office, right? And the open plan desk model was always meant to be like a feeder to sell desks so that they eventually get private offices. However, never really took. So it's now 90-10. And honestly, the open plan desks, even though they're useful, don't really expect too much income from them, because you're not going to really find, in my experience, people jumping at those month-to-month random dedicated desks. It's more, how can you use it to split up your floor plan so that it breathes really well, so it's not just an ant farm of offices? Or how can you thoughtfully put an island of open plan desks within a cluster of private offices, so it helps it breathe. But if someone wants to get out of their private office just to do some chill work, there's some open plan desks there, or if they've got some clients in town to use it. Think about it that way. So food for thought. You might have some beautiful stairs connecting the 2 floors. That would be great. But in a very capex expensive market, meaning where everything's really expensive to build right now, especially in the Asia Pacific region, stairs are potentially a no-no. Okay, so let's talk about the building stacking plan. Traditionally, ideally, and you'll see a lot of operators fight for it, you'd almost want level 1 and level 2, right? Because then you can integrate into the ground floor, and you can fight for ground floor concierge services and integrate it that way. So you've got this seamless experience. And in an ideal world, you also have stairs going from the ground floor into level 1 and into level 2. So you have this interconnected experience throughout all of the floors. But that's not always going to happen, because that's a scenario where you might be a landlord and you've got a new development and you want to pick where it goes. Then sure. I actually think there's a really compelling argument if your building's big enough. You've got those turnover or changeover floors. I keep calling them turnover because one of my favorite desserts is apple turnover. So I know they're not called turnover floors. I think they're called changeover. But I think those turnover floors are really attractive, right? Because if you've got the high rise, the mid rise, and the low rise or whatever, having to interchange on a floor like that, why not make it a destination? And especially as a co-working or a flex product offering, if you're trying to sell into the tenant community of the building as well, and not just externally out to the market. So if you're a landlord watching this, and this is more for, yes, you want a business to be run, but it's really for your tenants. I mean, having it on the low-rise floors near ground floor is kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Especially in your larger buildings, because they can't all access it equally and easily. You'd almost want it in the middle of your building, right? On a turnover floor, changeover floor. So think about that. Also, in terms of where you put it in the building, there's a lot of assets out there that are looking at co-working and flex, I think, the wrong way. It's the solution to their vacant floor that hasn't been able to lease in the longest time. Sure, we can look at it. But yeah, there's the low rise, level 1, level 2 ground floor and the turnover floors. Obviously, you could put it somewhere on the top, but I think the opportunity cost of high rent up there is too high to consider it for co-working and flex, especially because it's on a variable income style model. What I do think is really attractive is that, if you have spec suites, in your building, say like on these floors, and you have the flex, let's call it on level 1, level 2, you can service those spec suites. So earlier when I was saying level 1 and level 2 up here, when I was drawing the diagrams, it's better to have all your amenities on one floor so that the staff can service them easily. Well, imagine if one of those community managers, because they have extra time, they can now service some of those spec suites in your building at an additional cost, like almost hotelify your building to a degree. I think that's really interesting. So let's move on to the right-hand side. In terms of, we'll go from top to bottom because all of these things are really interesting. So let's make believe you've thought about your 2 floors. You kind of know what you're doing on level 1 and level 2 loosely in terms of product mix. You know where it's going to go in the building. Now, how do you calculate your revenue and your financials, right? Especially if it's a preliminary feasibility study and you don't have a test fit yet. Well, a pretty safe desk density, I'd say, even in a post-COVID world, is 6.5 to 7. And that's square meters per workstation. That doesn't mean there's actually 6.5 to 7 square meters around a workstation. That is a calculation that accommodates, circulation, amenities, including meeting rooms, concierge, all that kind of stuff. It's almost like a rule of thumb metric for a co-working style business model that is very desk dense heavy, so that they can look at like a 2,000 square meter floor plate and figure out how many desks they're going to have in that model without thinking too hard. They just divide 2,000 by 6.5 or 7. And they're like, oh, that's how many desks I've got. And then they can chuck it in their very basic calculator and be like, well, if I sell desks at $800 a month and I've got this many at this occupancy rate, that's how much I could make just of desks, right? That's a bit dangerous when you do FISOs, because what if your floor plan has all these massive columns? It's not the sexiest or best floor plan for just cramming a lot of stuff in. Doesn't mean it's not a good floor plan, but it just might mean it's not a perfect square like I've drawn. It could be like this, weird horseshoe shape or something, where then that metric does not work at all. And with these kind of feasibilities, if you're even 50 desks short or 30, or in some cases for the larger ones, up to 100, it really messes with your numbers, right? So don't necessarily apply that 6.5 to 7 directly to that plan. What I like to do is I like to engage, and I always work with one of our designers. I get a CAD file or a PDF file of the floor plan. I tell them what I'm thinking, and then they'll actually kind of mark out, even if it's just high-level bubble diagrams on the floor, where he or she thinks they can fit the desks. And then I ask for the square meter allocation or square foot of the areas marked out as office, because we've kind of plugged the meeting rooms, the amenities, the concierge, the circulation already everywhere else. So there's a little bit of an exercise there. But then if you get this new number, so instead of applying a 2,000 square meter metric to the 6.5 density number, and you get an actual number of, there's 1,200 square meters or 1,000 or 800 or whatever it is across your NLA, then you apply, 3.5. You divide that by 3.5 square meters, because that's kind of the area you have around that desk to mess with, 3 to 3.5. Then you'll have a pretty good estimate on how many desks you've got for private offices. Now, this is before you even start splitting them up into 5, 10, 15, 20, 30-person offices. For now, just for the sake of this feasibility study, you just need to kind of have a pretty good understanding of how many desks that you have within that floor plan, right? And then meeting rooms. Again, if you've got a designer, it's always kind of good to mark out areas of where you want meeting rooms so they can help you with that. But in the spirit of this example of 2,000 square meters, I wouldn't go any more than, a large 12 to 18 person boardroom, maybe 2 6 to 8 person meeting rooms, and 2 4Ps, and then a podcast studio. You don't really need more than that unless you've got a massive building and the tenant community is asking for meeting rooms, and this is an opportunity for you to put more meeting rooms in a space that's being operated as a co-working space, okay? Any more than that, they're just going to sit there empty, because meeting rooms, and we're going to talk about occupancy percentages, meeting rooms are great on a spreadsheet, and the danger is to assume that you'll sell more than they will actually sell for, because the risk is a meeting room is only sold on a per hour rate. Sometimes you get lucky and sell them for half a day or a day, but they're per hour. Whereas private offices or even the dedicated desks are at least a month or 6 to 12 months at a time. So more steady income for your financial forecasts, right? Shame on you and sneaky, if you're putting in a bunch of meeting rooms and you're assuming they're going to be full majority of the time. That's going to look great on paper and actually earns way more money dollars per square meter than any desk or private office model, but it just ain't going to happen, okay? At least within the Asia Pac region. In terms of occupancy percentages, when you think about your dedicated desks, I think, I accidentally rubbed that out. I think 80 to 85% occupancy is what you should be shooting for with the private offices. I think it should at least take 12 months to ramp up and hit that. You can start at, let's call it 30% occupancy day one, because you're assuming in that forecast that the 3 to 6 months prior to it, you're going to be doing some pre-marketing and, some teasing, and you're going to be speaking to agents to help you fill that. And you're even going to pre-hire some of your staff 1 to 2 months early so you can pre-fill it, because that 30% occupancy should cover your operating costs and your staff, right? So you're not out of pocket paying for the costs of that co-working space. So that's generally the idea. When it comes to meeting rooms, I think 15 to 25%. Well, that's pretty good. I've seen scenarios where you can get up to 40%, but don't model it for any more than 15 to 25, up to 40%. It really depends on the product that you're slogging. What are you offering with that meeting room? Does it come with some form of hospitality, food offering? Is the meeting room particularly interesting or unique? Like, have you fitted it out with some really dope audiovisual equipment? Is it a podcast studio? Maybe, those creator studios, I think you could probably argue for a higher percentage usage, not just because they're unique and attractive, but when you think about it, when you create content, you don't just book it for half an hour or an hour. You're probably going to be booking it for half a day, right? Especially the marketing teams for all the different corporate companies within that building who need to shoot content. They'll be booking that room out for like a whole day, right? So that's why that utilization, that occupancy usage goes up, right? And the percentage for meeting rooms, when I say 15, 25, 40%, you apply it to how many hours between, like 8 a.m. and like 4 or 5 p.m. Monday to Friday minus public holidays are available. And then you apply that occupancy percentage to that and say, we're going to sell this many hours out of the 100. You never sell 100 because you're going to be turning over those meeting rooms. There's also, it's really difficult to have back-to-back meetings. I always think there's a bit of a buffer time there that doesn't work. Also, depending on your co-working model, you might be giving away meeting rooms for free, meeting room credits. So that's going to be at least 30, 40% of that occupancy gone because you've kind of already baked it into your desk package price. So think about all these things, right? Event space occupancy percentages, I think goes even lower. I'd say 15%. If you do well with event room hires, because it's seasonal, you never know. Again, it looks good on a spreadsheet to forecast, but it's dangerous too, because then the FISO could look a lot better than it can. I would almost just highlight it as a potential revenue stream that you can really optimize. So it's like, cream on top if you do really well. So in the comments, if I miss stuff, just ask, because I'll do more of these. And if I miss some detail, because I'm just kind of firing it off the top of my head, we can do it again. So when you talk about revenue, you've got really these channels. You've got your private office revenue, private offices. So we'll do it one. You got your dedicated desks. This isn't going to be much because again, the ratio is going to be like 90-10, right? You got your meeting rooms. You got your event space, if you've got one. I'd say you've got your virtual services. So this is really, this differs for every company. You might have mail, you might have concierge services, you might have address services, really depends. If you're a landlord setting up your own co-working business, the virtual services stuff might be a bit light because you don't have an existing brand to leverage that and you need to set it up. So you're really playing around with those 4 metrics. You might have, instead of virtual services, you could call it like miscellaneous or something like that. This is if you're leveraging your on-site staff within the space to do secretarial or concierge services and stuff like that for some of your tenants. You can factor that in, right? Am I missing anything there? Some co-working spaces will say they'll have memberships and all that kind of stuff, but I think those are the main ones where you're making majority of your money, okay? And then obviously there's different ways. There's other omni-channels of revenue that you can create that might be specific to your building that you want to think about, but those are the big 4, 5. Never put food in here. Food and beverage, no. Bad FISO. I've worked with a lot of hotel operators who are way better at doing food than any co-working operator or any landlord, and food is tough, right? Margin is very slim. The only way that food could ever work and you could ever model for it is if you've got presence on the ground floor, so you can serve food not just to your co-working community, but also to foot traffic outside, but then you need to be a specialist, so hopefully you've partnered with someone. You've got a commercial kitchen that can cater into the tenant community in the building, and you've got a tenant community willing to purchase it, so don't just pretend that they're going to order from your food. And then, you service all your meeting rooms. So then suddenly, with the same kind of similar costs within a food company, you've got these different revenue streams. And even then, it's tough. But I would not put food as any form. You could put food as revenue, sure, in your FISO, but don't put it making any margin or profit. Just, again, cream on top. Now, in terms of operating costs, I want you to break it into three things. We'll break it into property costs. 1, 2, operating, I know I already called the whole thing operating costs. And 3, what was the third one? What do I call the third one? I know what it is, everyone. I'm just trying to figure out what the terminology is. We're going to call it landlord. Landlord and fees. Yeah, okay. So your property costs, think of your utilities, your cleaning, your repair and maintenance, all that kind of stuff, right? Your operating costs, think of your staff, your technology, your marketing, your community engagement. So all of those costs I want you to group into your operating costs, because it's just nice to understand what you control and what you don't control. So the property costs, they're pretty much linked to the size of your space. You can't really control that, right? It's almost like $1 per square meter rate that you got to pay in terms of cleaning, R&M, blah, blah, blah. Operating costs you can control. And the reason why this is interesting is you might go light when it's lower occupied, when you're ramping up in that first year, or if for whatever reason you take a bit of a dip and you need to shave off costs. That's kind of what you can control. So group it there, whether it's the marketing, whether it's the community engagement, whether it's staff because you went in heavy at the beginning and you want to just shave off a little for now. That's the kind of thing you control. Tech, it's kind of like the software they use for the booking platforms and everything when you set up. The landlord and the fees, you can put this in the operating cost. I kind of put it in here, but it's nice to keep it separate in your FISO. In Australia, it's like landlord outgoing, so it's all the costs for the building cleaning and the maintenance of those floors that you have to pay to the landlord. But then also your flex operator fee, right? What is that? Also under landlord, you might have rent in there, but it really depends. I don't know who's watching this. Like if you're a landlord, you just take it out of your profit at the end of the P&L. You don't need to put it in there as a cost necessarily. But it's whatever rent obligation you have. And if you're an operator engaging with someone under a management style agreement, that's a negotiation point, right? It doesn't have to be market rent, could be half of it, could be a revenue share model, don't know, right? It really is case by case. So you got your revenue, you got your operating costs, flex operator fee. So just to list a few, there's a couple of ways to look at this. And it's important for you to understand this, even if you're a landlord trying to do it yourself and you're not engaging with a flex operator and you're thinking, I don't have to pay someone this money. It's good for you to understand what that money could be worth, because then you're trying to, in your mind, realize, well, is it easier for me to just pay this sum of money to someone else so I don't have to deal with this? And then I can go back to being a landlord full time. What's my next building? What do I need to do? How do I engage with my tenants a bit better directly, rather than running around trying to figure out how to optimize this co-working business or this flex business? It's more of a complicated model and a business than you think, because especially even if you get the detail down, just think about how chaotic it is going to be in your head. In this scenario, 2,000 square meter floor plate over 2 doesn't seem big. If you've got 50 to 100 customers in there because of the size of the offices or the desks that they take. You might have some big ones and small ones, and they're all kind of they're all in 6 to 12 months licenses. Yes, you get a premium on it, but then your team's going to be at 80% occupied one day, 100 the other, and then down to 61 because a big client leaves. So then you're always going to be thinking about, what am I doing to stay ahead to keep this business to keep the retention of these customers as high as selling them and onboarding them. It's just retention is probably, I'd say, more important, because any operator can get people in because they'll just discount the crap out of their opening offering, which is actually an interesting point that I missed at the very top in terms of revenue. I'm coming back up here in the revenue box. I always like to model within year one, whatever your market desk rate is in package, a 25% discount in year one. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but in your feasibility, put it in there. Act as if year one, to hit your 80% occupancy target or whatever you want to model for, you're giving away your desks at a 25% discount, which is essentially like, if you sign on for 12 months, we'll give you 3 months for free, just to help it feel full and buzzing, because nothing kills a co-working space more than it being dead. Right? It needs to have some form of community there, and it'll help you sell. And then it's your job to create such a great experience there that when it's time to re-sign them, you go back to the original price, or you etch your way back there, okay? So what was I talking about? Flex operator management fee, yes. So there's different ways to do it. The reality is, if you're just wanting to understand this business and you're an operator and you want to do it, forget about the fee. You're just going to pay rent, right? You're just going to pay rent to the landlord. And if you're a landlord just looking to do an RFP, request for proposal, to get a co-working operator in there, and that's the model, forget about it. Just take the rent, and don't think of them as someone who could optimize your building and do things for it. They're not. They're just a tenant, right? Under a management style agreement, you could have a base fee. You could have a rev percentage share and a profit percentage share, right? And it depends on the size, but something like this. Every operator is different, so I'm hesitant to throw numbers around here, even though I know what I would charge for this. Maybe reach out to me offline if you want a detailed model and everything built for you. Totally can do that. And normally these models are like 5 to 10 year forecast, because it helps the valuers when they look at it, how they plug it into their own building value calculations. So when I say that, coming back to the building stacking plan over there, a big thing around flex spaces right now in the market is because they want to partner with landlords under a management style agreement. It could impact the value of the building because it's a variable income style model. So I've done a video on special purpose vehicles and how they're being used. If you're interested in that, I'll put that link in the description. But that's kind of why they look at 5-year, 10-year models. And the SPVs, the special purpose vehicles, are ways that, at least in Asia Pac, they're setting up kind of holding companies to avoid that valuation dip, because the variable income style model gets hit with a bit of a discount by valuers currently, because they like looking historically and not at what this flex could do for the building from a positive angle. But anyway, you can watch that video if you want. I talk about it more. So coming back to it before I move on to the flex operator fee, it could be base fee. So think of like a meek number, but it's just something in there to cover the minimal costs for an operator slogging their ass to kind of get this business off the ground. And then they'll take a revenue percentage and profit share fee. For a space of 2,000 square meters, rev share percentage could probably be 7. Profit, it depends on how you define profit. Like, is it just revenue minus costs, or is there going to be a rent hurdle included in there? Like half rent, 75% rent, 25% rent, because then the profit pool decreases, so then the percentage changes. So it could be 50-50, or it could be, 10% to the operator. It really depends on how you manage profit. The way you figure it out is just what kind of number is that operator trying to get to. But then inversely, as a landlord, what kind of rent do you expect from that co-working business, even if it's not a guaranteed rent and a rent equivalent? That's how those percentages change and go back and forth when you negotiate, because you're both trying to... Oh, nice. My brother just watched a movie 28 years later. I really want to watch it, zombie film. He says it's really good, so I'll try and watch that this weekend. Landlord added value. So these are some interesting things that are not numerically measured necessarily yet, but I challenge you to do it if you're doing a flex feasibility study, and I can show you how I do it if you're interested in another video. One is tenant retention and attraction. So if they're putting a co-working or a flex space within their building, providing flexibility and amenities to their tenants within the asset, and the reason they're doing it because the tenants are asking for it, there's a very strong and heavy argument to be made that that's going to actually improve the tenant retention and attraction of that building. And a way that you can calculate that, which I've helped certain fund managers do in the past in Australia, is you calculate the percentage downtime, the reduction of it. So, okay, well, normally if you factor in this percentage of downtime within tenants within the building, if by putting co-working and flex in it, we reduce it by at least this much, or this big upcoming vacancy that's about to hit us, they're asking for co-working or flex, and by putting it in there, they're going to stay. What would that vacancy have been? What would have been that model? Suddenly you've got $1, right, rate for that year that you can factor into. So then as a landlord, you're not just looking at the flex P&L that comes out at the bottom. You're also looking at, well, it's saved me this much money. What does that look like? So that's an example of a landlord added value metric that I would include. So I'm going to stop there because this looks horrible. It looks like I've just scribbled everywhere. Let me know in the comments, please, if you find this valuable, because I can go even more detailed. I can actually do the numbers for a thing, so you can see the revenue numbers, the cost numbers, the fee numbers, the dollar per square meter outputs, what a landlord sees. But if you approach a flex feeso this way, if you're thinking about doing a business, it's a good exercise for you just mentally to wrap your head around it and the things that you need to think about. But again, if you want to ever talk directly to me about this or do something in more detail, happy to, because I've done too many of these things to count at this point, where could be something as simple as a small tech startup hub, where a lot of those desks are subsidized because it's all about giving back to the city and the ecosystem, to really expensive, high-end, top-tier flex co-working spaces in some of the best buildings in Australia, right, where they spend a ton of money on the fit out and everything. So hopefully this was helpful, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks for listening.